ad hoc committee. We have not been together in quite some time. In fact, I think it's almost been a year. I think that we had, if I'm not mistaken, last year we had a series of unfortunate events, including snowstorms and what have you. And so now we're back. I think we'll start on the agenda. We have roll call, then we'll go to the approval of minutes, and then we'll go into the panel discussion, and Mr. Parker will introduce our guest tonight. So with that, I will go through roll call, and I will just ask for all the committee members to announce themselves, and I will start with myself. So David Skilling, present.
Charlie Abel, present.
Dana Gutwein, present.
Jacob LeBure, present.
Did I cover I'm missing Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. I tried it. I guess I didn't unmute. Mike Beta, present.
All right. Well, thank you all. So I think that's our entire committee. For folks that are watching, tonight, by virtue of this virtual meeting, we don't have live call-in for the public comment portion. What we've done instead, for the purposes of tonight's meeting, which is a largely informational meeting with the panelists will be providing some presentation, and then the committee members will have an opportunity to ask some questions. If there are public comments that come in, if you have questions or comments during the meeting, please email planning@lakewood.org. So again, that's planning@lakewood.org. And Laura will be monitoring that email address so that if there's questions throughout, we're going to make some time towards the end to ask those questions. So we'll come back to that. But if you can get your questions in, hopefully before, let's say 7:30 or so, and then or 7:45, and we can get those questions hopefully asked and answered. With that, again, let me just remind again, planning@lakewood.org. On the agenda is the approval of minutes from July 9th, 2019. So again, this is us. It's been a little bit over a year since we were all together, but it will be the approval for minutes. So I will make a motion that the minutes from our meeting on July 9th, 2019 be approved.
Second.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. All right, so that passes, and we will move on to the discussion for tonight. And this is our first foray into discussions about metro districts and special districts here in Lakewood, and any potential changes that we need to make as far as an ordinance to any of the existing rules. And we've invited several panelists tonight. I anticipate this to be part one, as far as the committee is concerned, and of course, subject to what the body decides. But tonight, I had assumed we have a limited time period with these panelists. They're each going to give a presentation, and we'll have a question and answer with them. And then we will need to have a follow-up meeting on this topic where we can actually distill some of these issues, have discussions amongst ourselves, have additional public comment, and then also ultimately make recommendations to the entire city council because really that's what we're here to do, is to sort through a lot of these weeds and then hopefully make some recommendations on some issues. I will point out that Mr. Hutchinson did present a thorough memo for us. I have thanked him for that in the past. I will do so again. It is a comprehensive look at the issues that are presented to us, and that is one roadmap that we can follow as far as issue spotting. What are a lot of the pertinent issues that we will be dealing with, and some of the things that we need to address, whether it's disclosures, debt limits, what have you. I think that that's a good place to at least follow along on the issues and what we're facing. I will also note that ahead of this meeting, Mr. Henderson, one of our panelists tonight, also did submit a memorandum that is a companion, or at least is his response to that staff memo. And that was something that was presented to all of council. And so this entire committee has that. Those are the two written documents that we have in front of us for tonight. But again, Mr. Hutchinson has laid out fairly thoroughly all of the issues. And maybe there's more the committee can discuss, but these are what I would view as the material issues in front of us and in front of council for the future. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Parker to get our panel going.
Thank you, Counselor. We have thank you for joining us, Council and the public that's watching tonight. We have a great panel of experts in metro districts. You heard that Jay Hutchinson is also here. He'll be available for questions at the end. But first we have, excuse me, 4 panelists who are going to join us, and I'll introduce them each as they do their presentation. And then once each of them has chatted, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion of the council. You do notice that on your agenda there are 5 names. Denise Gammon was unable to join us tonight due to a last-minute family issue. But the other 4 panelists are with us, and we're going to start tonight with Megan Schrader. Megan is the editor of the Denver Post's opinion pages. She writes editorials for the newspaper that represent the opinion of the Denver Post editorial board, of which she is one of 6 members. She also writes a personal opinion column and is responsible for selecting content for the daily opinion pages and the 4-page perspective section on Sundays. Schrader has been at the Post since September of 2016. Before joining the Post's opinion team, she was a Denver-based political reporter for the Gazette in Colorado Springs, a political and education reporter for the Oklahoman, and a City Hall reporter for the Gainesville Sun in Florida. She was born and raised in Grand Junction, Colorado. Thanks for joining us, Megan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background about how I became interested in metropolitan districts and started covering them, reporting on them, and then now writing about them from the opinion side. I grew up in Grand Junction, and just as a little background, my father is a civil engineer, and he developed 40 acres that I grew up on in Grand Junction into a subdivision. And he did it kind of the old-fashioned way, right? Went to the bank, got a loan, took on all of the risk himself for this very small subdivision, and built the roads, designed it, and then sold the lots and used the proceeds from those lots to pay off the loan that he took out from the bank. So that just is a preference that can be done. I was I was pretty young when it happened, but it is something that can be done without a metropolitan district, even though this one was on a small scale. I started covering metropolitan districts. I've always been aware of their existence and really dove in deep with them with an investigation into the Gaylord Hotel project in Aurora. And their layering of different taxing districts, including a metropolitan district, raised alarms for me. And then from there, it just kind of cascaded to me finding them as a reporter and writing about them. And then on the opinion page, I wrote an opinion column that just tried to quantify the extent of the metropolitan districts, how often they're being used, how much money Coloradans are on the hook to repay over the next 30 years, 30 to 60 years, and kind of how that lingering debt is a risk to Coloradans. If there is a big housing bubble, it could turn south and be quite difficult to get out of that debt. So just to be clear, I am now on the opinion side of the Denver Post. I am completely separate from the newsroom, from the work that David Magoya did as a reporter in his investigation and what he found when covering metropolitan districts. Just further to be clear, not everything I say today is our views held by the Denver Post editorial board. So those are just to make that clear. The board has called for 3 or 4 things specifically that we think could really help. After Magoya's news articles came out, we called for things on a statewide level, disclosure of all metropolitan district taxes on MLS listings so that homeowners know immediately when they are looking at a house what that additional tax will be, similar to how HOA fees are disclosed. We called for an elimination of the ability to charge fees, transfer fees, or whatever else the district might call them. We think there was we thought that lacked a lot of transparency, being able to impose these fees. And then to eliminate the risk of self-dealing by having truly elected officials on these boards rather than representatives from the developer, so that there really is somebody who's accountable to taxpayers or future taxpayers, as would be the case as these positions develop. And so we've written editorials calling for those changes at the state level in law, and I think those could be helpful. Oh, there was a 5th thing we called for, which was a change in state law so that no one could, to eliminate a loophole that allowed people who had a conflict of interest to vote on these boards. The loophole the law says clearly, hey, if you have a conflict of interest, if you are going to benefit financially from a project, you cannot vote on a matter. It applies to all elected officials, and it makes a lot of sense. But the loophole is that unless you are needed to make a quorum, then you can vote. Well, on these boards, everyone has the same conflict. They are all employees of the developer, and so the loophole is they all have the same conflict. They're all needed for the quorum, so they can just ignore conflict of interest laws and vote on matters they can benefit from. So I thought that loophole should be closed. So those are the main things the editorial board has called for, and that's just kind of a brief overview of where I've been on this issue and how I got here.
Thanks, Megan. Our next panelist is John Henderson. John has a master's degree in public administration as well as a law degree. He practiced law for 36 years in many areas, including land use and zoning, representing developers and residents. He has spent the last 40 years advocating for residents in land use issues in Connecticut, Virginia, Kansas, and Colorado. Welcome, John.
Thank you, and thank you to the staff and to Dave Skilling and, of course, the council for sponsoring this and putting it on. As you all know, I've been beating the special district or the metro district drum for the better part of the last 3 years in front of the council as issues came up. The last official presentation, I suppose, was when the Cardell organization proposed a special district. We did a detailed analysis of that special district proposal, and in response, they withdrew the application. I guess where I'd like to start is the posture, how we go forward. Clearly, there's an issue. The Post articles amplified what a lot of us were discovering or knew already, but they put it in literally black and white. We can see it, we can smell it, and we can feel it. And we know there's a significant problem. So the question is, how do we address it? And I think several communities are going about it in different ways. And again, I applaud Lakewood's approach to this in tackling it head on. But I think the very first question we have to address, and it won't be answered in an evening, it's something that I think will have to be debated and further presentation on. But the first question is, do we want special districts? Put another way, have the proponents of special districts or metro districts proven to the community that this is something that's beneficial to the community, that's good, that's something that we need? Until we answer that question, I don't think we get to the second question of potential ordinances or specific reforms. Longmont, as you all know, addressed this issue in the same manner that Lakewood is. They addressed it head on, and they voted to prohibit metro districts in residential developments. I participated in those presentations. We had, I think it was a 2 to 3 hour debate with Ms. McGreedy, one of the premier attorneys in the special district industry. She and I just went head to head and had a lot of good discussion and debate with Longmont. But in order to focus on whether or not we want special districts, you begin to look at, as Megan said, this is an exception. It's not the rule. The rule throughout the country, and I've lived, as you could tell, in many different jurisdictions, owned many houses, built on 80 acres in Kansas, trenched for the water, put in the sewer. I was my own developer, so I know the mechanics of it. So the first question is, why are we making this exception? The traditional way of funding infrastructure is to include that cost in the cost of the lot. The cost of the lot includes three components: the cost of the land, the cost of the infrastructure, and profit to the developer. $30,000. That's the industry measure. That's not a number I came up with. The Colorado Home Builders Association says it's $30,000. The SDA, the Special District Association, says it's $30,000. $30,000 is, on average, how much it costs per lot to put in the infrastructure. And all of this metro district legislation, the attorneys, the accountants, the managers, millions and millions and millions of dollars being spent to support metro districts is all about how do we pay for that $30,000. We know from the articles and from our own experiences that metro districts are the least efficient and most expensive way to do this. Not only economically is it bad, but from a, I'll say, political or local government perspective, it's bad. Because the way these metro districts operate, the vote of the residents that's guaranteed in the Colorado Constitution through Tabor, the right of the residents to vote on future debt, taxes, future bond debt. That's the very first thing they do is they eliminate that, they being the developer, eliminates that in the ballot issue. And we can get into more detail as to the documents that you all would need to look at if we go forward with an ordinance. But in eliminating that right to vote, we're basically saying, you know, in order to make it more convenient and less risky for the developer and provide an income stream to them that is unchecked. I mean, it is unchecked. It's more convenient. It's more productive for the industry. We're going to take away the residents' right to vote in Solterra and also in Sheridan Station West Metro District out there. They assign the right and give the power to issue debt to the board, take it away from the residents. And in our case, in Solterra, for 11 years, they canceled the public elections because they said nobody wanted to run. And when you talk to the residents, well, why didn't anyone want to run? The residents said, well, they told us we couldn't. The developer said we could not sit on the boards until they were built out 75%, which is completely wrong. So we have a history with these metro districts that shows clear and terrible abuse, not only financially, but also politically, and the integrity of the local government is completely compromised. So the first question is, why do we need these? And I would suggest the way to do this is to put the burden where it lies, and that is with the development community, and say, okay, listen, let's start with a blank piece of paper. Blank piece of paper. Prove to us why you need these. You know, there's several myths saying, well, it's cheaper. No, it's not. We can't do it because we need the money. They had the money before. In Solterra's instance, they had the money for 11 years before they started collecting bond proceeds. I think I've probably run out of time, but I look forward to further discussion on the issue and answering any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Our next presenter is Tom George. Tom is a partner in the law firm of Spencer and Fain, where he counsels municipal and local government entities throughout the state of Colorado in all aspects of formation, operation, and dissolution. Tom helps existing special districts such as metropolitan districts, water and sanitation districts, business improvement districts, and other governmental authorities with day-to-day operations, and provides efficient services to property owners and constituents. Tom also counsels developers in the creation of taxing districts to allow the utilization of tax revenue and municipal debt to finance public improvements and to provide services to support residential, commercial, and mixed-use developments. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you, members of council, for inviting me here tonight. Also, my fellow panelists, good to see some of you again. Haven't seen you since we were on a panel last time, Megan, I think. As Travis said, my name is Tom George. I'm an attorney at Spencer Fain. We have a special districts group of about 15 of us from attorneys and paralegals and support staff that almost exclusively represent local governmental entities. And our firm and our group represent, and we included, the whole smattering of them across Colorado, from metro districts to water and sanitation districts to intergovernmental authorities that provide services and other types that there are across the state. We've organized them, represented them, even dissolved some of them, consolidated some of them, represent them as general counsel or special counsel. We've also done some work from time to time with municipalities in a special counsel role or counties to advise on special district issues and financial issues and kind of anything that touches or concerns it. That full sort of smattering of legal parameters that apply to special districts in Colorado statute. I do want to say here at the outset, just for full disclosure, that if I look familiar, you may have seen me in front of you over the past couple of years on behalf of Cardell the Indigo at Red Rocks Metropolitan District. We do represent Cardell. We were there. We likely will be in front of you again as they propose that district. I just want to say that at the outset, so you're aware of that. I'm certainly not representing them here tonight, and I'm not advocating one way or another for that client or any other clients. I'm here on my own tonight to provide input and my perspective on things and hopefully answer any questions that you might have. I do think what you're doing is a good process, and it's important. I think that the jurisdictions across the state have taken different approaches, and it's what I like about local government is it allows us in this state, in localities, to take the approach that fits for you and your community. So some, special districts and metro districts have been around for a long time. I mean, more than 40 years. They've been more prevalent in some parts of the state than others, in some parts of our metro area than others. But there's a long history of it. And different counties and different municipalities have had different parameters in place or no parameters in place of their own choosing for a long time. So not that you're late to that party or anything, because everyone is always taking a look at it. As you know, councils turn over and boards turn over too. So and development changes and your constituents do too. So I think it's good that you're looking at it. I'm happy to be part of it tonight. I hope I can provide some useful or valuable input. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And I will say too, just because I always like to say it, I think the way Megan does, I'm a West Sloper myself originally. I grew up in Rifle, but I've been here in the metro area since after law school. Live in Jefferson County myself, out in unincorporated Jefferson County. And we love it here where I'm raising my 2 kids and live with my wife. So not in Solterra, south of you, John, but out in Jeffco nonetheless. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Tom. Our final panelist tonight is Kyle Thomas. Kyle joined DA Davidson's Denver office in 2019 after previous work with George Baum and Company, and has been involved in more than $1 billion worth of tax-exempt financings. He is a senior vice president of the Special District Group at DA Davidson, which as a group has been underwriter of more than $7.5 billion in Colorado Special District debt over the last 10 years. Kyle has participated in transaction execution and quantitative structuring of both tax-exempt and taxable debt financings for Colorado special districts and local governments, with a particular focus on Colorado metro districts, having served as investment banker to more than 50 districts. Kyle holds an MBA and an MSM from Indiana University Kelley School of Business and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Purdue, and is holder of multiple U.S. patents. He's registered municipal advisor and holds Series 50, 52, and 63 licenses. Welcome, Kyle.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Council. For having me. We don't have our this evening to speak, so maybe I'll represent a little bit of that perspective as we work with them quite frequently. So again, our firm is very involved in the financing of metropolitan districts. We're an underwriter of bonds. We've been very active in that community for some time. So I'll happy to speak about that perspective and answer any questions you might have. So we come at this from the perspective of how can metropolitan districts be used as an efficient tool to finance infrastructure? In the Front Range, we have a significant shortage of new housing, which has exacerbated the affordability problem. I think we can all acknowledge that housing prices have increased considerably, and we continue to have a shortage. And along with that, cities and counties, including Lakewood, have required significantly more public infrastructure for new communities. And it's been a challenge for many cities to really be able to fund the necessary infrastructure for these communities. So metropolitan districts are a tool enabling for growth to pay its own way, where the taxes collected from a metropolitan district can help put in the specific infrastructure to support that community that's going to be constructed. If you were to look across the state at the top 20 selling residential communities, all of them have a metropolitan district. So it's certainly a tool that's used anonymously with metropolitan districts provide about a third of the public infrastructure.
Kyle, are you there? Looks like, did anyone else lose Kyle? Okay.
We may have to come
Yes,
back.
Yep.
I did too.
We may have
So
to come back to Mr. Thomas.
Okay.
Hey, Laura or Travis, if we have a phone number for Mr. Thomas, maybe we could just have him call in, maybe instead of the video. If the video is presenting an issue, the calling in sometimes solves that Zoom issue that we have quite frequently.
Are you back, Kyle?
I am. Yeah. Can you not hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
You were breaking up a little bit, but now you're good.
Okay. Apologies for that.
And just where we lost you, I think, because this is where I lost you, you were saying the top 20 communities in Colorado all have metro districts, and then it started getting super choppy. And then you closed.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I lost electricity at my house and the internet went down earlier. So maybe we're having some intermittent issues in the neighborhood here. So yeah, I'll just continue. So in general, metropolitan districts can provide about a third of the public infrastructure in a community. And it could be that the developer funds the remainder through their own capital or through, a loan or something to that effect. But that typically their capital is going to be, has an expense to it. They have a certain profit margin. So that might be in the, 12% plus range versus a district has the ability very early in its life to borrow in more of the 5 to 6% range. So it's an efficient tool. For many projects, it's just a developer cannot walk into the bank and get a loan for horizontal infrastructure. It's possible, much more possible to get loans for vertical construction, but a lot more challenging for horizontal construction. I also just want to speak to the service plan protections also. There's service plans which are authorized by the city, have mill levy caps. They have termination dates. So typically the maximum mill levy is 50 mills and the maximum amount of time is 40 years. There's limitations on the amount of total debt that can be issued, on the interest rate. The funds can only be used for public infrastructure as defined in the service plan. So there's a very narrow limit to how those taxes can be used, the amount of taxes that can be levied and the duration. Also, we talked a little bit previously about transparency, and I think having better transparency is a great goal. And we completely agree that there could be more transparency in how homeowners understand metropolitan districts. It's a complicated issue understanding taxes. I know one of the frustrating pieces is just from the 2-year lag from when a home is built to when it's assessed to when the taxes are actually realized. And that's not a metro district problem. That's just how taxes work. When you purchase a new home, there's a bit of a shock once your real valuation kicks in. In terms of other transparency, metropolitan districts are local governments, so they're subject to the open meetings request. There's public notices that are required. Colorado Open Records Act applies. There's transparency notices that are posted on an annual basis. There's information that's recorded against the property that would show up in any title search. Audits are made available on the Department of Local Affairs, budgets. So all of the financial information about districts is available on the DOLA website. Also just want to talk a little bit about how developers control a metro district in an early stage of a project. There are other forms of local governments that could solve similar functions. So metro districts are not the only districts that exist. There's general improvement districts, which can be in cities, which the board of a GID is city council. Counties have local improvement districts. There's SIDs, there's business improvement districts. And ultimately, metro districts have become the most common because it's putting the landowner, who's oftentimes the developer, who is closest to the project and knows the most efficient way to build their project and fund their project puts them in control of the board in the early stage. They are the landowner, they are the property taxpayer at that point, and ultimately, as they move out of that position as being landowner and taxpayer, homeowners and new landowners can come onto the board through an open election. The other piece we want to talk to is just about the types of financing mechanisms that are used. When you have a variety of, each district is different in terms of what types of houses are going to be built, how fast they're going to be built, different price points, that the flexibility that metro districts provide, where you have 50 mils for 40 years or whatever those numbers might be, they provide the ability to come up with whatever financing tool meets the goal of that developer most efficiently. So you see a variety of financing structures, whether it's senior bonds or subordinate bonds or bank loans or cash flow bonds, and it's all meant to provide the most efficient financing structure that builds the most infrastructure as possible. So it's really about how each district accomplishes its goals and priorities in the most efficient means. The other piece to this is oftentimes when you're doing an early stage transaction before there's been a lot of development, these are bonds that are sold to the public market. They're sold to investors that are making an investment in our community. They are sophisticated investors that are typically purchasing in very large denominations. And if for some reason the bonds get behind on payments, they're not able to make their full payments, it's the investors that are really at risk of not receiving those payments. The homeowner is going to continue to pay 50 mils regardless. As we say, 50 mils for 40 years is kind of the typical limit on how those taxes are assessed. So I guess I'll stop there and we can maybe just jump into some questions.
I'll turn it over to the chairman at this point where I think the presentations are done.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you to all of you for giving those introductory remarks. We had received, prior to tonight's meeting, Councilor Abel had submitted some questions, and I think those were forwarded to each of the panel members, or at least those, I believe those questions were forwarded. Mr. Parker, you can confirm or deny that. Maybe we should start there, in fairness to Councilor Abel, because those were questions that were submitted. So maybe I could turn it over to Mr. Abel if he wants to either re-ask those. Maybe that would be better for the public, so that they can hear those questions. And as I told him, I thought they were really, really good questions, some of the same ones that I had. So Councilor Abel, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to take it away, I know you're shy. But if you would indulge us and go ahead, I'll give it to you.
Okay, I will try to recall them. The first one, I believe, the largest concern is how do we ensure that metro districts follow the rules? DOLA has no real teeth. The Solterra districts, Fossil Ridge, for instance, for the first 3 or 4 years of their existence, and maybe to this day, didn't comply with the court order that created them. They failed to file their service plans and their financial statements with either the city or DOLA. How do we ensure that occurs? How do we, speaking of service plans, how do we word our legislation so that changes to service plans have to come back to the city council? Once we authorize something, it seems that they can just take off and change that service plan in any way they want, as long as it's not, quote, significant change. Significant is not a word that is easily defined. So let's go with that one. How do we assure that service plans and financial reports stay true to what was approved by the municipality? And how do we ensure that all the conditions of formation are followed?
Looks like John would respond.
Thank you. Charlie, that's a great question. Of course, I'd still like to start the discussion with, do we need them at all? But if we do get to the point of talking about an ordinance, I think that's one of the first things that the city needs to do, one of the themes they need to establish in the ordinance. And mechanically, the state legislation provides you with a wonderful opportunity to do that. When you approve or when you receive an application and consider it, you can conditionally approve that application. And there's no limit on that time period. And what I proposed in my materials was that you conditionally approve every application. That is to say, you don't approve any application unless it's conditional. And conditional until it's 100% resident run. That is, you've got 100% of the board are residents, and none of them are employees, principals, or agents of the developer. And what that does, that gives you the opportunity to call them in on the carpet at any time, to impose reasonable but short rein, if you will, monitoring and reporting requirements, so that you essentially replace what used to be in the marketplace. When Megan's dad was building, he had a loan officer looking over his shoulder in order to make sure that he was spending the money on the development and not a European vacation. Right now, there is absolutely no check and balance on developers in how they spend their money and where the income comes and what they do with it. And our efforts to try to get Brookfield to make those disclosures in the course of our work the last 3 years have been completely fruitless, completely stonewalled. They won't tell us. So mechanically, you make every approval conditional, and you have conditions written into the ordinance that provide for monthly, if not weekly, reporting about how they're spending the money, what they're doing. And if they don't comply, you can call them in and say, it's terminated. It was conditional. You didn't comply. You didn't earn it. It's gone.
Looks like Tom would also like to comment.
Yeah, I just would like to respond to that. I think I think the intent behind Mr. Henderson's suggestions valid. It just would never work. Conditional approval legally is not tenable. You know, it's a multi-step process to form a district. First is the service plan comes to you, and the city council has to approve that service plan. It then goes to the court. You file a petition with the district court, who calls the election on the question of organization. The voters vote. And then you have a valid election. And under our statute, our state constitution, elections cannot be challenged after a certain period of time, and for good reason, because including your elections, all of our government elections. And then you're asking a developer potentially to go out to the bond market. So the notion that you could have some condition on that approval that could instantly revoke the election, revoke the court approval and decree, and potentially undo a bond transaction would not work and would make it impossible for the district to function. So I just don't see that as tenable. I also kind of see it as unnecessary. I think the more reasonable approach is what you want to do is be clear as much as you can in service plans and language of what the requirements are. We require you to do these things. Maybe that's file more regular reports. Maybe that is certainly if you want to put debt limitations, and you need to just make sure it's clear each time what those limits are. And then the statute does have, you do have recourse in statute. And remember, the term you'll hear is material. If it departs in a material manner from the service plan, you can file an injunction. You can go to court. You have a statutory legal right to take it to the courts and say that this district's not compliant with its service plan. It has departed in material manner from it. And we're asking the court to enjoin the district from doing whatever it is that they're doing that violates their service plan. And I think you'd be clear in your service plan, both these are A, B, and C things you have to do. And if you don't do it, the city absolutely retains its right under statute to enjoin you, district, from doing what you're doing.
Megan, you can go.
So I would just say the service plans are full of loopholes. And if no matter how tight, I worry that no matter how tight a city tries to write their service plan to prevent some of the concerns that we all have, it'll be, that these people who had these districts will find ways around it. I had someone refer to it as whack-a-mole, right? You tamp down one issue and another one will pop up. It's similar to tax law, right? You think you've stopped an abuse of the tax law, and then all of a sudden they found another clever way around it. So I would argue that the best way to ensure that these districts are using their money for the in proper ways, that they are not abusing junior lien bonds, that they are good stewards of taxpayer money, is embrace yourself, council members, is for city council members to temporarily stand as the board members who are making these decisions as truly elected representatives of these areas until residents can take over. I truly think that that handing over developers a blank check and saying, hey, have at this taxpayer money, we trust you to do the right thing with it, is a slippery slope. And if city council members, cities are not experts on how to draft these service plans. It's just is ripe for abuse. I think that is one thing that should be considered, is making sure that there are truly elected representatives on these boards, assuring compliance, looking after taxpayer money. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. I'm sorry, there were a couple, unless somebody else wants to respond to that. I have a
John, did you have a response?
Yes, if I could.
Additional one? Okay.
Yeah, just briefly, and I appreciated Mr. George's comments. I certainly understand how his clients would be unhappy with this, but the bottom line is there has to be change, and the statute specifically says you can do a conditional approval. They wouldn't have written that in there if they didn't mean it, and they know what it meant. Second of all, the ultimate hammer that the city has is also written in the statute. And if the special district or the metro district doesn't comply, what the city can do, and the statute says it can do this, is to eliminate, to remove, to revoke any power they have to issue debt. You all are in charge of this show. You created this thing, and you have an opportunity, if not an obligation under the statutes, to do something to protect future residents, so that what happened in Solterra, what's happening in the Sheridan Station West Metro District never happens again. Thank you.
It looks like Mike Beta and Charlie Abel both have their hand raised. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Does he have any questions?
David called on me because I had 4 questions. Okay. May I finish those?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll do it quickly. We need to figure out how to ensure a rapid transfer of these district powers to the residents that live there. Mr. Thomas said, oh, now we're a local government. That's one of my concerns. We're making local governments out of a group of poker buddies who went together to form a company to build some houses.
Here, Charlie.
And then they vote for each other to form the government. So we need to modify that as quickly as possible. How can we ensure more transparency when someone goes to buy the home? As I've said many times, you get this one piece of paper stuck in the middle of all of those closing documents, And when I bought my homes, it's like, the next one is this, zip, zip, zip. And there's no time to ask questions, look at papers or anything else. So how do we make sure that, I like the MLS listing, Ms. Schrader, that's a very good idea. I would like to employ that and some backup for it to make sure these folks know what they'll wind up paying in the long run, what that 50 mils amounts to after 40 years, and what it would have cost them had those money's been folded into the infrastructure and sold as part of the home selling price. I think that about covers it. If anybody would like to address those concerns.
I think we had Mr. Thomas was mentioned specifically, so maybe we will let him go first.
Yeah. So in terms of homeowners having better notification about purchasing into a metro district, I think that's a great idea. I think there's some good concepts, whether it's using MLS or whether it's any model home that's in a metropolitan district just has an informational piece. I know there's some there could be some other tools used to educate homeowners on what that means and what the tax impact could be. I think just for a lot of homeowners, they don't understand how to calculate their taxes. Just the concept of, I buy a home for $500,000. What's the assessed value? What does 15 mils mean? Like, just that concept is lacking for many people. And I think if you could just walk them through the math of what that means, and they can make the decision on, okay, well, for me, living in this house means I'm going to pay, an extra $1,500 in taxes a year. And I think because of the amenities that are being offered in this community, that's worth it to me. They can make an informed decision. So I think that totally makes sense. In terms of the board members, there's many districts. If you look across special districts in the state, there's lots of districts that only have 3 board members. It's oftentimes challenging to find people who want to be on a board. It is a public service being on a local government board, whether it's a metro district or water and sanitation district or a fire district. So there are certainly many metropolitan districts across the state where you've had board members who are developers that have been on that board for 12 years, and they continue to be on the board because no one has run. Now, in other districts, homeowners are trying to get on the board as soon as there's an election. There's an election every 2 years. Each board member, when they are elected, they have a 4-year term. When that term is up, any qualified property owner or resident of the district can run that board position. So, the concept of how can, could city council sit in that position? I don't know how many metropolitan districts there are in Lakewood, maybe 15 or so, but
30.
If 30, if you were to sit on the board of all 30 of those, you can just imagine how inefficient of a structure that would be to have you been now responsible for, in addition to all the important things you do for the city, making decisions for 30 local governments in addition to that. So I think that presents a real challenge. That's where the concept of, by really defining the scope of what that metropolitan district can do through the service plan and through the protections that are put in place, we make sure that that local government is operating within that framework and you're not bearing that excessive burden.
John, do you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. With respect to the transparency, Charlie, I put together a draft disclosure. You can disclose in literally half a page or less the financial information that a homeowner would appreciate knowing when they go to a special district. And raising this issue, and I know the state's legislature is looking at a proposal that the industry has put out there, but in discussing this issue with some of the industry lobbyists, the response oftentimes is, well, we really need to go into a lot of detail and explain to them how mill levies work. No, you don't. You just need to tell them how much they're going to pay each year for their taxes and how much or how long they're going to be paying that. And all this, and they say, well, all this information is hard to find. And, well, yeah, it took me 3 months, and I'm an attorney. All the information is there. It's in the ballot issue. In the ballot issue, the voters, the 8 employees of the developer, voted to establish a debt finance limit for the residents of $4.9 billion. That's not in the service plan, but it is in the ballot issue. And if they put it in the ballot issue, and if this was something was voted on and was presented to a court, then why isn't it presented to future homeowners? Likewise, information in the service plan is there. It takes a while to figure out what the service plan is and where to find it and what it means. You can put those numbers in the disclosure just as easily. So there's a short laundry list of financial information that every potential home buyer should have access to. And I suggest there are three points, 3 contact points. When they first walk into the sales office or have that first, meeting with the salesperson, and they sign an acknowledgement. Yes, I got this. And, with all the other papers they keep track of for potential customers, they keep that piece of paper too. The second point is when they first make the offer, you disclose it to them again. And then the final point is at the closing, which, as we all know, nobody's reading much of anything there. You've got the keys. You can't wait to get into the house and start decorating. With respect to the local government, I appreciate what Mr. Thomas is saying, and that's the way maybe it ought to work, and it all sounds very good. But we've lived it. We know how it really works. And we had people who went to nomination or went to meetings when the developer was deciding who they were going to appoint to the board. We had residents turned away by the developer's employees saying, we've already decided who the board's going to be. They didn't say they could run for an election. They didn't advertise that. The elections, the cancellation of the elections were published in the hub, and nobody knew what that was about, with all due respect to the Post. And as I said before, folks were counseled for 11 years that they couldn't serve on the board until it was billed out 75%. So you have a complete disconnect between the principles and the theory that are set forth in the statutes and what actually happens. And we saw kind of the ugly side of that in this last election cycle. A lot of folks were now aware that they could run for the board because of the Post articles. They knew the process and they started to do it. There were instances where the developers were funding campaigns for their employees or favored clients, $20,000 for special district or metro district campaign. And they were doing other things to suppress the vote and try to discourage citizens from participating. And then what happens when those citizens get on the board, and this is an institutional problem for citizens and residents in these special districts. They need legal counsel. They need attorneys. They need accountants. They need engineers. We're going to be loyal to them, not the developer. And that is almost impossible. I have talked to attorneys, tried to get attorneys to get involved in this on behalf of residents as opposed to the developer, and it's very, very, very difficult to find. So they're not only fighting to balance the inequities that they started with, but they don't have the professional help to do it with. And it's going to happen, but it's taking some time. And that's why it's so important that the city stand in for the residents, protect the residents, the future residents, and provide that oversight. I've worked with developers for many years. I work with residents, and the development community will rise to the occasion. If you set a higher bar, they'll meet it because they're going to do business. They just need to know what it is. And just like with the 200 effort, we have to say very firmly to the development community, we're in charge. The city, the residents, the representatives of the residents are in charge of making policy for land use development. And this is the first start. Setting the bar, setting the requirements, either through a conditional approval or very clear reporting requirements built in to the service plan. You could build into the service plan. You've got to tell us monthly what you're doing, what you're spending the money on. You've got to report to us on a monthly basis until the residents are in charge of those boards and can take over. Thank you.
And finally, Megan.
Charlie, I'll just point out real quick that a really simple way to make sure that residents, future residents in these districts can take control sooner is to only approve one district per development. So one of the ways that developers are able to carry out control of the finances of these districts for years is by getting approval of multiple districts on the same project and then funneling the taxpayer money from one district to the others as they progress. So the money is always going to a district where the developer has control instead of the districts where the residents have control. And I think that if you just limit it to one district and say, developer, you have to work within this single district, that would really clear things up for residents. It would give them control faster. It would give them transparency would be simpler. I just think that is one simple thing you can do is say, we are only giving you one district per project, regardless of how massive your project is.
Thank you. Thank you all. That's it, Megan. I'm sorry, Laura.
Are you done with your questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It looks like Councilor Bita has a question.
Yes, thank you, Laura. Excuse me. Actually, I have a series of questions, but I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I'll kind of do them in a piece at a time so other people can jump in. But I'd like to first make sort of a preliminary comment here, and then I'll go ahead and make a couple of questions, and I'll kind of leave it up to our panelists as to who wants to respond to it. But first of all, I just want to say that this issue of special districts and abuses by special districts and the potential draconian effects that it can have on the residents is not a new issue. It's not a new thing. And I turn your attention to back into the early 1990s when there was a district known as the North Castle Pines district in Douglas County. And they found themselves in a perfect storm. And that was at a time when home sales plummeted, home values and real estate values generally were way down, and yet the bondholders of the district were expecting to receive their payments, and the district didn't have the funds to do it, and it ended up in bankruptcy, and many of the homeowners found themselves in a position of having to cough up a substantial amount of money to pay these bondholders, otherwise they were going to lose their house. And I know this because I had a number of friends that lived in that North Castle Pines, and I was actually asked as a judge at that time to hear the case, but I had to recuse myself. I became familiar with it. I had to recuse myself because of conflicts, because I had a number of friends that lived there. But I saw what happened and what a devastating effect it had on the homeowners. And so it's the kind of thing that certainly we have to be aware of is possible with certain conditions. And so that leads me to my first question. I know we've had a lot of discussion here today about possible regulations and the service plan and how to requirements and so forth, but it's been suggested that perhaps one of the best ways to deal with this is just not permit or allow these special districts in the context of a residential development. And my understanding is there are some jurisdictions around the metro area that have done that. And so my first question is, why isn't that the thing we ought to be talking about first? And as part of that discussion, the question becomes, is it realistic to even think that local government has the resources and expertise to effectively oversee these special districts? Because that's what we're talking about here, is putting together guardrails to rein in these districts. And my question is that even realistic to do that? Because it is the responsibility of the city, in this case, the city of Lakewood, to oversee these by law. So if we create it, we have to oversee it. And my question is it even realistic to think that we're going to be able to do that? We would have to create another layer of bureaucracy within the city. And if you're going to oversee this, that's going to take some expertise. We're going to have some accounting and some legal who know exactly what goes on with these districts, who are experts in the field. And because these can get very complicated, the business plan of these districts can be complicated. And is it really realistic to expect a city like Lakewood, even the size of Lakewood, to undertake that kind of responsibility and that kind of oversight? And do we really want to undertake that kind of oversight by creating another layer of bureaucracy? And who's going to pay for it? And I note that the state, which to me would be a logical place for this kind of oversight, has punted. They don't want anything to do with it because it is complicated and it is going to be expensive. They've punted it and kicked it down to us. And I'm thinking, why should we do that? And I guess that's my first question to the panelists. And a follow-up question is, what's in it for the city? Why should we even get into this at all? Before we get into this discussion of how do we, put the guardrails on, what kind of, rules and regulations and oversight and all that, what's in it for us? Why should we even get there at all? So those are the two questions. One, is it realistic? And two, why should we get in it in the first place? And I'll leave it up to Laura to let the panelists respond.
Yeah, it looks like John and Kyle both have responses. Let's go with John first.
Yeah, thank you. Mike, that's where I start. And maybe the industry can prove to us why they absolutely need these, and we need to make an exception to the traditional way of funding. But when this came before the city of Longmont, to share their rationale with you, one of the reasons they decided not to allow metro districts for residential development was exactly that. They had long conversations with their staff. It was part of the open dialogue at the meeting. And they essentially concluded that this is going to take a tremendous amount of resources and time and money by the staff to do it right. If you're going to do it, you got to do it right. You have to replace the checks and balances that are eliminated when you eliminate the market system that traditionally funds these things. You have to replace those checks and balances, and the city's the only one to do it. And Longmont decided, we don't want to go there. We're going to have to hire a lot more people, as you say, set up a bureaucracy, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So there is some history, there is some precedent, in addressing that issue and how they decided it. I'll share with you that one of the other concerns that they had was, and I expressed this in the memo, taxpayers have a limit. We tax them for roads, we tax them for law enforcement, we tax them for schools, and we're now taxing them to, in essence, subsidize development and tax to pay profits. If you guarantee through these metro districts a higher tax rate, which the Post documented, development without a district on one side of the street, development with a district on the other side, the tax bill is going to be significantly higher on the metro district side. And those folks are going to say, listen, I'm already paying through the nose. And when you come knocking on the door asking for money for schools, roads, police, what have you, mental health, they're going to say, no, we're tapped out. Thanks.
All right, Kyle?
Yeah, a couple things. There was reference to some of the historical challenges with metropolitan districts, and there was a series of metropolitan district bankruptcies and defaults on bonds, and the code was changed at that time, and that's when limited mill levies were put in effect, which was a significant protection provided to homeowners. And so many of the previous problems have been addressed with the current statutes. Also, just to be clear, no homeowner who purchases a home is at any risk of losing their house if their metropolitan district bonds go into default. No bank would give you a mortgage on your house in a metropolitan district if that bank thought they could lose their position on that home if the bonds went into default. So that's not possible to lose your home because your bonds are in default. The worst thing that can happen under today's statutes is that you continue to pay 50 mils for 40 years. And at the end of those 40 years, when those bonds discharge, there's no longer that obligation. One other response, I didn't get a chance to respond about the downside possibly of having one district for a large development. When you have very large master plan communities, we're talking 1,000 homes. Those are often built in filings. You don't go in and put all the roads in at one time. You don't finish all the lots at one time. It just doesn't make sense. It'd be a huge amount of money to spend up front when you're going to develop a project over, maybe 10 years. So oftentimes the district boundaries are meant to coincide with the different filings that are going to be constructed. And it's a more efficient tool to issue bonds in tranches over maybe a period of 10 years as that development progresses. So as opposed to doing one large bond issue up front for homes that might not be built for 10 years, by having multiple districts, you can phase those bond issues so that you're generating the most amount of money with each one of those to build the most infrastructure as possible. It's just a more efficient tool. The other piece is just answering why do we need them? And I spoke about this at the beginning. It's such a common tool used across Colorado that for many projects, and we work with developers and home builders all the time, when they're looking at acquiring a piece of land, they will often say, hey, we want to know what the bond capacity might be, because this might make the difference between us purchasing this land and delivering this project or not.
That's right.
So there's projects that just would not happen in the absence of bond funding, because you could say, well, just take how much money you're losing from the bonds and add it to the price of the home. Well, if you do that, that home might be priced completely out of market where there's not a homeowner who's going to purchase at that price. But a homeowner might be willing to purchase at a lower price, and they're okay paying the extra taxes on an annual basis. So it's not just as easy of a solution to say, well, let's just make the house a little bit more expensive, because that just might not work. And there will be projects where the developer will say, well, if I cannot use the metropolitan district as a tool to help build the infrastructure that I need to put into this project, I'm not going to do the project.
That's maybe what you have to do.
All right, it looks like Tom has his hand raised.
Yeah, sure. I'll respond just quickly to Member Beta's comments. And I know we still have a lot to get through, so I'll try to be real brief in this. I just, I want to say kind of the outset in response to your question is I think maybe it's human nature, right? But it's really easy And I'll admit there are bad developments and there are bad developers and there have been abuses of metro districts. But for some reason, it's so easy in human nature to take a bad example and a bad experience and extrapolate that across all developers and all developments and assume that its sky is falling on metropolitan districts because abuse is rampant everywhere. When in reality, there's almost 4,000 of these local governments in the state, and the large majority of them are successful. You just don't hear about it because no one writes about it. No one complains about a successful development. So I would hate to see you foreclose the possibility of utilizing a development tool because of a few bad examples. I think more important is to see what works for you. And for me personally, when I think about why a metro district or why a district on a development, for me, it boils down to two things, why you would do it. One is enhanced improvements or enhanced services. Because I think the reality is that in Colorado today, there is demand for housing, there's demand for commercial, and there's demand for real estate. And developers will develop property when the demand is there. So you have the choice to say, does the developer want to come in and build what the development's entitled to under the current zoning? And maybe you like that, maybe you don't. Or is there an opportunity here to use a development tool that allows for enhanced services or enhanced improvements by adding a layer of financing here so you can get something more out of this development than just pure market demand might give us? A few examples, and a few examples why I think you would never want to say blanket prohibition on residential in developments is things like transit-oriented development. You know, if you want to put in a residential or a mixed-use development that's near TOD, it might require a parking structure, and parking structures are expensive. They're not only expensive to build, but they're expensive to insure and to maintain. The city's not going to want to maintain that or own it over time or insure it or pay for security. But perhaps that development locally right there will, because the neighbors on the other side of town don't want to pay for that development. So maybe you can put that enhanced improvement of a TOD, the cost of that right in that development. Attainable housing and affordable housing are serious issues in Colorado, and in Lakewood in particular. With an aging community, they're getting priced out of homes. So if you have a developer that can come in and you allow that developer to use a tool such as a metro district, that then can be built into their pro forma. And now they start to have some wiggle room that they didn't have before. So now you can work with them in their land use and the district to say, well, why don't you build some affordable housing in here or some attainable housing here? Or how about different types of products? So now we can try to get to the end result that Lakewood really wants by allowing them to use that tool. So for mixed uses, attainable housing prices, TOD is a big one that's important. And as we continue, maybe none of us know what transportation will really be like, right? Our cars will drive themselves in the future, but this tool can allow you to enhance these developments. And that's why I think it's important to look at it on a case-by-case basis rather than blanket say, we're just not going to use them at all.
All right, Megan? Michael, I think I would say I question the need for these districts, right? I come with great skepticism about whether or not developers need this to be able to finance their projects. So if you're not comfortable with a blanket abolition of these, because as Tom pointed out, there are, Belmar used metropolitan districts, and that is an incredible, urban infill project that has been wonderful. So why, if you're not comfortable going all the way and saying, we're never going to use this financial incentive for developers, one thing you could do is require the developer to do a but-for analysis for you, right? But for a metropolitan district financing system, right? We could not do this project. And here is our pro forma that explains and shows you exactly why that is. Our return on investment would be too low. We would cut back on our amenities if we couldn't do this. You are requiring us to set aside 10% open space, and that's, we would really love to do that for you, but we can't. But for getting $100 million in taxpayer money to pay for that infrastructure. So I think that should be the council's threshold going forward, is that the developers have to bring their numbers to the table and prove that but for these taxpayer dollars, we cannot do this project. And here's why that project is, going to be extremely valuable. It'll help reduce housing costs by just increasing the housing stock. We're going to provide affordable housing, X percent, and it's going to be a wonderful community. That I think that should be the threshold.
It looks like John has one last comment.
Yeah, sorry. There was a lot to unpack there. I'll try to hit all the points quickly. First, with respect to the change in the statute to impose limits after those bankruptcies, and Castle Pines is one of the best examples of that. The statute in name imposed a 50 mil limit in principle. And then the statute went on to create so many loopholes. It's got more loopholes than Swiss cheese. In fact, there is no limit. Look at Solterra. We have Mount Carbon, 21 mills, and we have currently 43 mills on Solterra. That's over 50. Look at Candelas over at the Rocky Flats. They have 3 special districts, 3 of them, 3 metro districts. They are already at 100 mills. Closer to home, Red Rock Center, the disputed area between you folks and Morrison that defaulted to the county. Mount Carbon, rose like the Phoenix. They're the sanitation district. They've got a 50 mil rate on those residents. They have a separate metro district that has its own limit, 50. So they're subject out of the box without anybody moving in. They're already subject to 100 mills. And I think they've actually set the mill rate at 66. So in fact, it sounded nice, didn't happen. With respect to the multi-districts, we have 3 districts here. Big Sky has 7 districts. It was a cute little maneuver presented by the attorneys, with all due respect, to manage the control through what they call the lead district or the master district. So every district I've seen, including the ones around the airport and Denver and further north, they all create these multi-districts that have absolutely nothing to do with boundaries, geographic boundaries. They just create multiple districts in order to manage the control, so that you have the districts that everybody lives in are the taxing districts. And you have, in Solterra's case, 10 square feet where nobody lives. That's the master district. And that's the district that the developer owns. And the developer makes all the decisions. They just decide how much to tax, how much to spend. And those other 2 districts, and in Big Sky's instance, the other 6 districts, where the residents actually live, their job is simply to write a check. So it really doesn't work that way. With respect to the bonds and the financing, the bond companies that represented here in this meeting, they are making a lot of money, and that money is guaranteed with taxes. And to say the homes aren't at risk, I think is misleading. If the district is obligated to pay that 50 mils, if they don't pay that 50 mils, there's going to be a lawsuit. And the reason the bond companies love these and the reason the investors love them is because they're guaranteed with properties, with homes, and people are going to do everything they can to avoid losing that home. So it's a really good risk. And if they can't pay it, ultimately, the collateral is the home. And I've heard a couple of times that this is a common tool. When I first started beating the drum here in Solterra, the attorney for the developer-oriented board said, literally, it's just the name of the game. It's just the way things are done here. You just have to get used to that. That's not a good answer. That's not a good answer for why you take away the vote of the residents on future debt. That's not a good answer for why they're paying, in our case, $2 million a year for the next 40 years. And Brookfield wants another $30 million, twice what we are already paying. We need changes. There are ways to do this. We raise the bar. We get everyone to work together, but we need changes. Affordable housing, that was presented to the Longmont folks. It's a red herring. Folks, you know how affordable housing works. The only way it works is through subsidies. The developers are not going to give away the lots. They're not going to subsidize the houses. They're there to make the profit. The only way you're going to get affordable housing is through government subsidies. And this doesn't do it. And we had, several examples in the Post articles where young couples moved in when the tax bills, and this isn't waiting 2 years to see what the new assessment is. This is the special district tax bill that's a result of passing bonds and bond debt. That's not wait until you get your next tax statement in another year or two. They couldn't pay the taxes. So you get affordable housing, like I'm sure the folks who were looking at the Sheridan Station West Metro thought, well, maybe this is going to be affordable housing. The debt there is already more than the debt we have here in Solterra. It's already there. So even if you have, so those, you're going to be essentially, the only way people can afford those houses is through folks who are at the higher end. And even if you do get folks who are lower income or moderate income, when they get hit with that tax bill, they're going to have to leave. So it sounds nice, it sounds flowery, it's really kind of a sexy things to say. This is going to help affordable housing. But when you peel away the leaves of the onion, the only way you can do that is with subsidies. And this is not creating subsidies. It's creating a higher tax burden. Then finally, on the Balmar, I've talked to a couple of the commercial residents there, and they're not happy. But they're more sophisticated than your average homeowner. They had the attorneys, the accountants, and they went into it with their eyes open, and there was a benefit. But that's not what we're talking about, at least in terms of the abuses. We're talking about residential developments, not mixed use. We're not talking about building a high-rise parking structure. We're talking about putting pipes in the ground in the streets, the street lights for residential development. And that's where the abuses have been rampant and need to be addressed. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here real quick and just remind everybody that we're coming close to 7:30. So if we may have to make things a bit more concise to try to get through all of the committee questions. We have a very limited time with the full panel. So if we can just kind of giving a little time alert, and then Laura, if we have any questions from the public, again, that's planning@lakewood.org. If we have any of those, maybe get those ready for 7:45. But I think we've got either Mike has a follow-up, and then Dana's had her hand up as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I do have a follow-up, and I'll make it quick. I'll direct this to Mr. Thomas, to his point about nobody ever loses their house because of the special district tax. Well, that may be true in principle. I want to make sure we all understand how it works. The fact is that the deed of trust will take precedent over the lien created by the special district. Wouldn't that be correct, Mr. Thomas?
Yeah, and I'm not a real estate law expert here, but my point was that as long as a homeowner, if you pay your tax bill, you're not at risk. If your district goes on default for their bonds and you've paid your tax bill, you're not at risk. Now, if you don't pay your tax bill, whether those taxes are due for a metropolitan district or the county or the school district, that's another matter. So I'm only speaking to the fact that as long as you as a resident pay your taxes, you can't be at risk.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, thank you for that clarification. The other question I have, and any of the panelists can address this, but once the homeowner buys a home and closes on it, and then let's say it's early in the career, early in the development process, and then a year or two later, the taxes for the special district kick in. What does that do to the value of the home at that point? And not only at that point, but certainly for years to come, because what I have seen in the past is that the value of the home drops substantially once those mill levies kick in, and oftentimes it takes a number of years for the homeowner's value of his home, his or her home, to come back to what they paid for it at the beginning. They're underwater for some time. And a lot of it has to do with the tax burden created by the district. Do you want to comment on that, any of you on that?
Looks like Megan has her hand raised.
I think that until the mill levies get really high, you don't see the districts suffering in terms of price. And that goes to reflect the fact that homeowners do not know that these taxes are going to hit them. And so they're not calculating it into their financial decisions, which goes back to the point that this is not contributing to a lower price of the home, right? Those homes are being sold for what the market will bear at that time. And because so few homeowners are aware of the different impacts that taxes can have, they are not calculating that into their financial decisions. And so you are not seeing these mill levies affect the prices of homes like you would expect to, because homeowners don't know, so they can't calculate it into their financial decisions. We knew when we purchased our home, because I'm a reporter and had been covering these, that we could afford much more house outside of a metropolitan district, right? We're in the city of Denver, we pay 76 mils, something like that. And so our, mortgage is, $200 a month for property taxes in that escrow account. Well, we looked at houses that were the same price range, and the mortgage payment would have been another, $400 more expensive because of the metropolitan district. And we calculated that into our financial decision, but until we get disclosure of these mill levies on MLS, homeowners aren't calculating it in. And once they start to, I think you will start to see prices being driven down in metropolitan districts with the highest tax mill levies. So homeowners are savvy, and they will say, I can buy that same house over here and it'll be $400 less a month in tax in my escrow payment, and it doesn't have the fees or the HOA. It just is. Once homeowners know, then you will start seeing that.
All right. Anybody else on that? I appreciate that. Okay, I'm done then. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Councilor Gutwein.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Quick comment is that I think that the challenges and cases of abuse are well documented, and I think we all understand, and that I personally believe that we do need to make changes. I like all of the recommendations that Megan has made. I also am a huge proponent for affordable housing, transit-oriented development, all of that stuff. We had a great project that this council approved that involved a metro district. So, I think that there are cases and there are bad actors, there are good actors. My questions are, one issue we haven't talked about is the election. Actually, I'm going to start with a different question. First of all, I just want to clarify. I'm looking at an article that in the Longmont Leader that says that they actually did revise this rule, so they do allow residential metro districts. Is that accurate? Just a simple yes or no, please.
No, I think what you're looking at is Longmont in 2018 or?
This is a 2019 article and I'm reading it. So I'll just pass on that one. Thank you, John.
I can answer.
I'll just research it on my own because we only have 25 more minutes and thank you.
They at one time allowed, for 1 year in 2019, they allowed special districts and then they reversed themselves after the articles came out and they had further hearings.
Thank you. Okay. One of the challenges that we have heard a lot about is about the election process and either not having elections or homeowners being unaware of election. Any suggestions on how to improve the election process itself?
Looks like Tom.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Member Goodwin. In fact, your memo from Mr. Hutchison has this recommendation in it. And in our most recent service plan we had in front of you, this came out of dialogue we had in a couple of our long evenings together on that service plan. And that was, I think the issue, while true, what Kyle said, in a lot of districts, they have a hard time finding a full slate of board members, that you just don't have homeowners that are interested to serve. That does happen. But I think that the suggestion that you all had when we discussed and we added that service plan was to provide more notice to the residents that the election's taking place. They're going to start their May and even years. Starting in 2023, they're going to be May of odd years. And that is to mail notice to every voter in the district of the election coming up, and also to make sure that notice goes on the district's website. Because the statute currently requires only that it get published in a newspaper of general circulation in the county. And as you know, those are typically publications that people don't pick up and read.
And John? You need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, direct communication. And I suggested also putting it in the disclosure that they get when they buy the house or when they first shop for the house, putting it on record that they have a right to serve on the board as soon as they have a contract on the house.
Thank you. Next question is, I understand the transit-oriented development argument, mixed use. Are there other cases that really require, like as Megan mentioned, this but-for analysis? What are some other examples that would be impossible without a metro district?
It looks like Kyle has his hand raised.
Yeah, I think Mr. George spoke to this a little bit earlier, and it comes down to amenities. So in community planning, if you want to deliver a very basic community that has streets and sewer lines and water lines and curb and gutter, and that's all that's provided, then that's one thing. If you want, I think most homeowners today, they want more amenities. They want more parks. They want play structures. Maybe they want a community center. Maybe they want a pool. And if you're going to ask a developer, a land developer or a home builder to put in many of these extra amenities, using the tool of a metropolitan district can be a great way to deliver some of those amenities that most likely would not fit into their financial plan if they were going to develop the community without metropolitan districts. So I think it's really, what do you envision your community looking like, and what sort of amenities do you want to offer, and how are you going to fund those, and what tools are available?
And John? Oh, I think you had.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I just share with you my own experience. I lived in Northern Virginia, expensive community to live in, Fairfax County. We had 3 swimming pools, recreation center, more, probably by 3 or 4 times amenities that we have here in Solterra. No special districts.
Does that count? Does that city have Tabor or the Taxpayer Bill of Rights? I'm guessing no, because I'm pretty sure we're the only ones in the country that do. So I appreciate the examples from other states. However, they're under such different circumstances that it's not very helpful to me, but thank you.
Well, let me explain. Tabor, I think what you're referring to is the limit of the...
I'm aware of what Tabor is.
Very good. The limit of cities to pay for infrastructure without permission from the residents. What I was about to say was that those amenities in Northern Virginia were paid for through the cost of the lot. They built that into the cost.
But we, as a city and as a state, have a limited budget for transportation, which we already do not have enough money to maintain our current infrastructure. So, but thank you.
Respect, that's apples and oranges.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Apples and oranges. City
You're making an apples to oranges.
Public improvements, not improvements to a community, to the development. All I'm saying is amenities is not a reason to do a special district. Those can be funded and have been funded more efficiently through the traditional mechanism of financing.
Thank you for your opinion, John.
No, that's fact.
Okay. My final question is, Megan, I've really appreciated all of your insights and recommendations that are also legal. And do you have any other ideas that are not necessarily from the board itself, but to close loopholes, to address additional concerns that we should be aware of?
So the other big thing that I think most people aren't aware of are transfer fees and other fees that are assessed at the time a house is sold. So homeowners don't know this is going to hit them until they sell their house. There were some limits put on transfer fees, and now I've noticed some districts are calling them other things than transfer fees. And I think that closing that is important because there's it doesn't seem to be a real clear need for it. If you've got your tax base and you're generating revenue that way to pay off the bonds, it's just a much more transparent way to do it. I think to have people not be hit with this, 1% fee at closing when they're selling their house.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
So we only have 2 questions from the public. It's from the same person. Do you want me to read that now?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that because I want to get the public comment in now while we're still ahead of 7:45.
All right. So the public comment is from J.D. LeLue Jr. And he said, understanding that full disclosure might deter potential homeowners from purchasing a home within a metro district, can someone please explain why a metro/special district is more valuable to homeowners and not to builders?
Can you just repeat that one more time?
Okay. All right. Do you want me to share it? Well, I'll just read it one more time.
Sure.
Understanding that full disclosure might deter potential homeowners from purchasing a home within a metro district, can someone please explain why a metro or special district is more valuable to homeowners and not to builders? Looks like Tom.
Yeah, I could take a shot at answering that anyway. I think think it's certainly possible that it might deter a homeowner from buying. I think in my experience, working with builders, developers and home builders, that they disclose that to the seller when they're buying. It's part of the same conversation of why buy in this neighborhood, why buy in this development. So it goes into the conversation perhaps of the amenities and things. And I think it's valuable to the builder, and I would say it's also valuable to the homeowner. And I guess the question is, why is it more valuable to the homeowner? And I think to answer that, you kind of have to look at the long-term picture. So if you have a community, for example, that has, and we're talking about enhanced improvements, there's also sometimes challenges with certain developments, particularly here in Jefferson County, where we all are. Stormwater is a great example. We have stormwater issues, and stormwater improvements are expensive, and they take long-term ownership and maintenance of it. The county's not going to do it. The city doesn't want to do it. Someone's got to own it, insure it, and maintain it. So if the homeowners, they have then the control over that, or the parks, or the landscaping, or the trails, the homeowners can serve that board. On that board, they control their own amenities. There's snow removal contracts, their landscaping contract, the maintenance of those improvements that serve their development itself or their neighborhood.
Okay, I'm going to just quickly say his other question he had. We might have addressed it, but I want to say it really quickly. His other question was, how can we balance developer risk with the abuses we have seen in special districts? Do you want me to repeat that one again, or?
Sure.
Okay. How can we balance developer risk with abuses we have seen in special districts? And it looks like John has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's what we're really trying to address here is how do we address the abuses? We all admit that there are significant abuses. And just parenthetically, every district I've looked at, and I've probably looked at more than 30 up and down the Front Range, I haven't seen a successful one. They all have these abuses. What you don't have is people making a big deal about it. And we had that experience in Solterra. When I first started raising the issue, I was told by one of the leaders in the community who was a resident. He patted me on the head and he said, "Don't rock the boat." I think folks are embarrassed once they figure out what happened. They're embarrassed that they're being charged for all these expenses, and they're stuck with this big bill. And folks selling their homes are going to be real aggressive in calling attention to the fact that there's, as Megan says, there's a higher burden in the metro district. So I think the reason some folks conclude that there are success stories, it's simply because they haven't been vocal. They're suffering just like everybody else is, but they just don't talk about it. But in terms of balancing the risk and the abuses, I come back to the bottom line. As Megan said earlier, show us the numbers. If you disclose the numbers, and in our case, prove to us that you've earned that $30 million, we'll pay it. But they haven't been willing to prove it to us or show us or give us the information to allow us to evaluate it ourselves. Thanks.
And it looks like we just got one last public comment. Would you like me to read that, Counselor Skilling?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'll read it twice. It's a little bit longer.
Then maybe only once.
All right, I'll read it really slowly. Housing prices have skyrocketed in recent years, yet the cost of builders don't seem to have increased commensurately for labor and materials. Therefore, the difference would go towards profits. Why can't that differential be applied towards infrastructure cost instead of it all going to the builders' pockets? Would you like me to read that again?
Sure. While our panelists are formulating their answers in their heads, read it again.
All right. Housing prices have skyrocketed in recent years, yet the cost of builders don't seem to have increased commensurately for labor and materials. Therefore, the difference would go towards profits. Why can't that differential be applied towards infrastructure costs instead of it all going in the builder's pockets? All right, looks like Megan has her hand up.
I would just say that I have no idea how much the cost of developing has gone up. That's way outside my expertise, and so we should just ask developers what their costs are going to be and what their return on investment will be. And if it's transparent and we know, then we don't have to worry if homeowners are getting double charged for this infrastructure, once through their taxes and once through the price of their home, because it'll be transparent and we'll know those numbers, and we can answer that question and say, well, building costs have actually skyrocketed, and this is what it takes now. Or no, you're right, building costs haven't kept up with the price of homes, and this is all going to the developer's pocket. So I think that's a good question, and transparency would help.
Let me just interject real quick. In defense of the committee, a question like that would have been fielded by our developer representative on the panel, but unfortunately things happen. But yeah, that's why give credit to staff who had put together, Travis and his team had put together a great list that was well-rounded, and this certainly, so for anyone watching this, we did not exclude any developer. In fact, we had a representative invited and it was going to come, but things happened at the last minute. Unfortunately, it couldn't be here, but this would have fallen into that wheelhouse. So I just wanted to make that clear.
John?
Yeah, so I agree with Megan. I think it comes down to that full disclosure. And again, I think it would be great if we could have a discussion about whether we need special districts at all, and in having that debate, invite the developer community to make that full disclosure. Show us the numbers. If you can demonstrate that there is a need, that you can't develop without these districts, then we go down that road. But, folks keep sliding into, well, they need this money, they need this money. The bottom line is every development I've seen, and I've looked at, as I said, multiple, they already have the money up front. The special districts are all about paying that money back after 11 years or so. So they already have the money. They can do it. They can do it the traditional way. It's just a matter of how they get compensated and then how the profit margins are. But the bottom line is, these are entities that either are or are applying to be governments. If you're spending money on real estate, if you're spending money to develop, you have to disclose every penny of that transaction and that process. The same standard applies to these governments or potential governments and special districts. So we should not be shy about requiring them to make full disclosure on all of the finances related to these transactions. Thank you.
And that's all the questions we received from the public.
So let me just jump in real quick. I've certainly been listening to all the questions and the comments by the panel and the back and forth, and been taking notes. And at least for tonight's discussion, it seems like of all of the issues, we talked about the various memos. We have Mr. Hutchinson's memo that has all the various issues, but it seems to keep coming back to disclosures and resident control / transparency. At least these are some of the, I think a lot of the other issues may be wrapped up into those bigger categories. And I'll just, one of the main questions I had was, giving residents control as soon as possible seems to be something that I think a lot of people would be on board with. The question that I would have, though, is when you set up these districts and all the work is being done and the decisions are being made, there are no other residents. Period. So we have to get from somebody's making those decisions before the actual residents come in. So it sounds like we're trying to put as many precautions in place to protect those future residents from what these first initial folks who were working for the developers, because there's nobody else to do it, it seems like we're putting on all of these precautions. And I'm wondering if there's some other way to do it. Can some of these decisions be put off until the residents actually come in? What decisions have to actually be made at the outset that can't be put off until residents have control? A lot of that's rhetorical, because I know we've been talking a lot about that, but that's something to certainly think about, is how do we give control to the residents, and then they can make whatever decisions they're going to make. And then secondarily to that, I think we all recall after the housing crash, there were a lot of rules that were put in place. There was a lot of new truth in lending disclosures that came about as part of closings that didn't exist before. Simplified checklists and so forth. I'll throw this out there just as an idea, just thinking off the top of my head, but I'm wondering if there isn't some kind of a handbook, an informational thing that every metro district has to provide to residents that is a step-by-step, kind of like what we're talking about here. Step one, just so you know, developers controlling out of necessity the metro district right now. Here's when the first election will be. Real simple stuff, language-wise. None of this, page after page of legalese. Next page talks about what the tax looks like. Just so you're aware, this is what it's going to be. It's going to hit you pretty hard if you weren't expecting it. Yeah, I don't know, just thinking off the top of my head, if you made it really simple, all these issues that we're all talking about that we're struggling with, if we put that forward and say, hey, you've chosen to live here or to buy this house, maybe you have to be given that pamphlet or handbook a week before closing. I don't know. Just food for thought. Again, there wasn't really a real distinct question in there. From everything that I was hearing tonight from Councilor Abel to Councilor Bita, Councilor Gutwein, and then the panel, it seems like it's a lot about just ensuring disclosures. And as soon as those residents have control of that board, well, okay, then they can do what the residents are going to do. But what we're trying to do is protect our residents against any unscrupulous developers, everyone on this panel, I think, has mentioned, yes, there are bad examples. So our job is to protect residents from falling into something that they didn't know they were getting themselves into. So with that, those are just my quick comments. I mean, that's for another day. A lot of that was rhetorical. But if anyone else from council has any other questions for the panel, I think we should shoot them their way. Okay. And if
I don't have any more questions.
Okay. John, you have your hand up, and then I want to talk about next steps and all of that.
Yeah, and I didn't know if you were inviting comment, Dave, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when you look at the history of metro districts, it wasn't really until the 80s that we saw what's going on now. In most instances, you had a community of people who were already there. You already had residents, and they wanted to band together and fund to build a dam or build a sewer plant or whatever it was. But the people were already there. What stood out to me when I started researching this was, why are they creating these special districts before the people come? Because it's not until the people come that the money comes. All they're doing by creating the special districts before the residents come is basically boxing them into the corner that they can't get out of. So and I think it's a great opportunity for further discussion, but let's say everything's above board and it's going to cost whatever millions of dollars to pay or reimburse for the infrastructure, and it wasn't reimbursed in the cost of the lots. So you give the residents, when they arrive, you give them a choice. You can either fund it through this mechanism, a more traditional way, or you can fund it through a metro district. And you can create a metro district to pay off that debt. But we have quite a few steps to travel before we get to that point. But I think it's a great idea, because then you give the power to the folks who are actually being taxed and who are going to share this burden to decide for themselves how they're going to pay for this. So thanks.
And I'll just point out the reason that I kind of went that direction is because in my notes I had, Ms. Schrader's had, she had disclosures on MLS, elimination of transfer fees. She said truly elected board members, elimination of conflict of interest. I think Mr. Thomas had said that he agreed to more transparency is always good. Mr. Henderson had said one of the big issues is lack of resident access to ballot and board seats. And that seemed to be where a lot of the discussion was going. So that's why I kind of mentioned it in that way. It's just, a lot of the comments we're hearing is we might all be saying the same things when it comes to transparency and disclosure, that seems to be something that could go a long ways. Okay, with that, since we're at 8 o'clock, the next steps for the committee would be to have a follow-up discussion if you so choose on this. Before we go to that, let me just thank on behalf of City Council and behalf of all the committee members, thank you to all of our panel members, to Megan, to Tom, to Kyle, to John, for coming tonight and sharing this discussion with us. I think it's always helpful, and hopefully you're open to us sending you additional questions, whether that's by email, if we have some follow-up things that we think about. I'll certainly be watching the tape again, but I just wanted to thank you all for coming in, especially in this sort of unique setting. But thank you very much for coming in. So we do appreciate it.
Thank you.
The next steps, and that kind of why I think we might have more email questions to the panelists as we move forward is because I think the next step in this process is probably just to continue this discussion, especially among the committee members, receive public comment. And from that, I'm not suggesting that we have a panel every time, but I am suggesting that there are plenty of folks with plenty of knowledge that we should lean into and ask questions of, so that when we come back together and have discussions, we can be more informed. Or if the committee has some questions that it has, maybe we can forward those along to Mr. Parker and he could endeavor to find more answers, which is really just building off of Mr. Hutchison's memo, just kind of getting more nuances or getting more into the weeds on it. So I suggest that the next step with this is that we do reconvene this topic and as a committee have a discussion, have public comment, and then perhaps endeavor to come up with some recommendations if we think we can do that. That's where I think the next logical step is to have a part 2 of this without a panel, but more to just get into some actual actionable items that we can do. So any thoughts on that? Knowing that there are other topics that this committee has said that it wants to tackle. Mr. LeBure.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think, I'm certainly willing to continue having this conversation. I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruit things we can do to make this, process a little bit better. And I think you touched on a lot of the themes I think are pretty accurate on transparency and whatnot. And thank our panelists for giving us some of those ideas as well. I would just say, I assume that there are some cities that have gone down this road. I know we touched on one, but I assume cities like Denver and others probably have a lot more restrictive practices in place. And I think it might just be helpful if at the next discussion, we take a look at some of those cities just as a sort of comparative analysis, and obviously, pick and choose what's right for Lakewood. And then obviously, we can always have additional philosophical conversations about what's right for Lakewood as well. But I think that might just help give us a sort of starting point. So I just wanted to make that a suggestion. Thanks.
Does anybody, so let me just state it this way. Is everybody good with continuing this discussion among the committee? We've got Mr. Hutchinson's memo as far as issues. Is everybody okay with our next meeting being the part 2 of this? Again, understanding that there are other topics that this committee has proposed to discuss. So I guess we would be saying we would do part 2 of this. That would probably be the end of this committee, 2 meetings on this topic. Then it would, just so the public's aware, typically this committee has had these types of discussions. It then votes on certain recommendations. Those then go up to the full body as part of a study session or as part of a meeting. So it's not as if we're making final determinations. What we're trying to do is, this is our opportunity to really get in the weeds, to have the public weigh in, to have folks come in and talk to us where this really isn't possible in a lot of our bigger meetings. So with all of that said, are we good with just doing this part 2 as our next topic? We'll do metro districts, special districts again, and see if we can endeavor to find some recommendations. Is everybody good with that? And I have Dana and Mike.
Yes, I'm good with that. I think it's important for us to have some direction as to what we want to accomplish at our next meeting. That's all.
Okay.
I agree with Councilor Vida. I think we should absolutely follow up on this. I think it might be helpful if we started with a list of some of the recommendations that were made tonight, and or if council can continue to submit recommendations so that we can, get some of that groundwork done ahead of the meeting and spend some of the time kind of going through those recommendations and what may be a good fit for Lakewood. I also just want to thank all of the panelists very much for your time and insight and expertise to this conversation. Thank you.
So let me, again, with Mr. Hutchinson's memo, one of the great things about it, and again, it was a good memo, it does list out the issues. There are recommendations the staff has made, but that doesn't mean that we need to either follow those or discuss those or can't add many more to those. I think we need to use that at least as a roadmap, because if nothing else, it is great in identifying the issues. The ones that I had talked about, as far as, and what the panel tonight had really focused on, disclosures and resident control and elections, are all in that memo. Now, if there are additional recommendations that we want to bring, absolutely, that's what we're here to do. But let's use that as far as teeing up what the discussion would be. I would suggest, if nothing else, we're using that memorandum as a roadmap, and we know what staff has recommended, and we can take the knowledge we heard from the panel tonight, and then in further discussions, we can either build on those existing recommendations, make separate ones, whatever you guys want to do. But I think that's our roadmap. I think that's the way it's been set forward, and I think a very practical way. So let's just do that, I would say. Mr. Abel?
I think we can use tonight's meeting for a template. I would like to see that list well in advance of the next meeting, so we can make sure that it is as complete as possible, and perhaps even add other suggestions to it before it comes to us the night of that meeting. Was that applause?
I dropped my pen.
Oh, sorry. Dang it. Okay.
Yes, Mr. Councilor Abel, that was applause. That
oh,
was
great. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, okay. I mean, look, Mr. Hutchinson's memo, I think he dated that June 11th. Obviously, it's a big document. It wouldn't be really practical, I think, for us to go through all of it. So one of the things I was proposing is, our next meeting, we would use that document, that memorandum, and start going through it. One way we could do it is issue 1 starts with recommendation 1. I think it's somewhere around potential policy topics. I think it's page 11. I can distill it down and I can use what we talked about tonight and just kind of hit some big topics. We can do it that way. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the points we need to make is that, well, the first issue I think was very well brought out. Do we want to do these things? I think that needs to be part of that list as well. And probably the first topic we tackle. Depending on how we answer that question, whether we want to continue authorizing service districts, depending on how we answer that, we may not need further discussion. I'm not sure that's going to be the point of decision we come to, but in fairness, I think that should be on the list as well.
Yeah, and I think you're correct that can be on the list for discussion. My hesitation in stopping there, regardless of what the committee recommends, would be the full council are the ones that are going to be making that decision. And sure. I want this committee, let's say the council disagrees and says, no, we want to do metro districts or vice versa, whichever it is. I want to make sure that this committee makes all the recommendations it would like to make. And I just don't know how council would go with that threshold question. But with that said, I think that is something worthy of discussion that we can add to the roadmap.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have gone over by 11 minutes, but thank you all again to the panelists, and thank you to Travis and Laura and Lauren running Channel 8, and Mr. Hutchinson. Next time, please do not take all the oxygen out of the room and keep your answers a little bit more brief. That's my warning right now. But thank you, Mr. Hutchinson, for hanging out with us. And thank you to the public for checking in and listening to us. And with that, I will motion to adjourn the meeting.
Do we need to approve the minutes from the last meeting?
We did that way back at, I think, 6:04 or so.
Yeah, okay. It's been a long time. I can't remember that far back.
Okay, folks. Well, we are adjourned, so thank you all.
Thank you all.